Insulting Genghis Khan's diplomats. One of the bloodiest military campaigns in history didn't start with strategy, land disputes, or even revenge. No, it all kicked off because of what turned out to be a reckless and almost pointless decision. In the early 1200s, Genghis Khan, leader of the Mongols, was technically at peace with the Khwarezmian Empire. In fact, the two sides had even fought alongside each other against common enemies. Everything seemed relatively stable until a Mongol trade caravan entered Khwarezmian territory. That's when a local governor stepped in, ambushed the caravan, stole the goods, and killed the merchants. Now, Genghis Khan could have marched his army straight into war, but he didn't. Instead, he went the diplomatic route. He sent ambassadors to the Shah of Khwarezm, asking for justice and for the corrupt governor to be punished. But the Shah made a disastrous choice. Instead of smoothing things over, he had one of the Mongol envoys executed and then sent the man's severed head back with the others. For the Mongols, this wasn't just offensive. Harming a messenger was considered one of the gravest possible insults. To them, it wasn't just disrespectful. It was a declaration of war. So Genghis Khan answered in the only way he knew, by unleashing his full fury. His armies swept across the Khwarezmian Empire, burning cities to the ground, slaughtering populations, and wiping the empire completely off the map. Even the lowest estimates suggest millions of people died. And the destruction didn't stop there. The Mongols kept pushing west, crushing Persia, tearing through parts of the Middle East, and even making their way into Europe. Could all of this have been avoided? Maybe. We'll never know for sure. But here's what we do know. At that very moment, the Mongols were already tied up fighting a war in China. So by killing those ambassadors, the Shah may have accidentally set off one of the most devastating military campaigns the world has ever seen. World War II, German U-110. The story of the German submarine U-110 shows just how quickly a single mission can shift the course of an entire war. On its very first mission in March of 1941, the U-boat managed to damage 2 Allied ships. But the mission was cut short not because of the enemy, but because of an accident. One of its own guns misfired, injuring members of the crew, and they had to turn back. The second mission, though, in April and May of that year, would prove to be far more important. After sinking several Allied ships in the North Atlantic, U-110 found itself hunted down by British warships. On May 9, 1941, the submarine was hit by depth charges and forced to surface. This was all part of a British plan that later became known as Operation Primrose. Surrounded by Allied ships, the U-boat was in serious trouble. At first, the British opened fire, expecting the Germans to fight back. But when they realized the crew was surrendering, they held their fire. The submarine's commander, Fritz Julius Lemp, noticed something was wrong. The U-boat wasn't sinking the way it was supposed to. Desperate, he tried to swim back and destroy the Enigma machine, the highly secret encryption device Nazi Germany used to send coded military orders. But he never made it. To this day, nobody really knows how he died. Meanwhile, British sailors boarded the abandoned U-110, and what they found was priceless: the Enigma machine itself, along with code books and other materials. These captured tools gave the code breakers at Bletchley Park a huge advantage. They could now crack German naval messages, including a backup system called Reservehandverfahren. But here's the clever part. The British didn't want the Germans to know they'd pulled it off. To keep the capture a secret, they let U-110 sink and pretended it had gone down with everything still inside. That single recovery played a massive role in turning the tide of the Battle of the Atlantic, and in the war itself. Constantine V's trust. Sometimes the downfall of an empire doesn't come from the battlefield, but from misplaced trust. In the year 774, Byzantine Emperor Constantine V launched a military campaign against Bulgaria. The attack itself didn't go well. It failed outright. But even in defeat, Constantine still held a powerful advantage. Hidden deep inside the Bulgarian court, he had spies feeding him valuable intelligence. The Bulgarian ruler, Telerig, started noticing something strange. Every time he made a move, Constantine seemed to know about it in advance. Eventually, Telerig realized the truth. His government had been infiltrated by Byzantine agents. So he came up with a clever plan, or maybe it was just that Constantine was too trusting for his own good. Telerig sent a message to the emperor pretending he wanted to defect to Constantinople. He told Constantine he was ready to join him, but first he needed the names of all the emperor's agents. The reason? He claimed he had to make sure they stayed safe while he slipped out of Bulgaria, and amazingly, Constantine believed him. He handed over the entire list. But Telerig never planned to defect. Once he had the names, he ordered every Byzantine spy in his court executed. In one move, he completely wiped out Constantine's spy network in Bulgaria. It was a masterstroke of deception, and a brutal reminder of how dangerous it can be to trust the wrong person. The fall of the Berlin Wall. Sometimes history turns on a single word. In 1989, Günter Schabowski had just become the unofficial spokesperson for East Germany's ruling Politburo, the Communist Party's top decision-making body. The government had recently held a meeting about loosening travel restrictions to West Germany, but the plan wasn't supposed to be public yet. At a routine press conference, Schabowski casually mentioned it. A journalist immediately pressed him. When would these new travel rules go into effect? Schabowski shuffled through his notes, clearly unprepared. Not finding an answer, he shrugged and said, "As far as I know, Myrda immediately." That single word, immediately, set off a chain reaction. East Berliners, believing the border was finally open after nearly 3 decades, rushed toward the Berlin Wall. Crowds formed within hours. Border guards, completely caught off guard, had no orders from above. But they'd also heard the press conference. Unsure of what to do, they eventually opened the gates. What followed was nothing short of historic. People flooded across the checkpoints, climbing the wall, celebrating, hugging and cheering as East and West Berliners embraced for the first time in 28 years. By 11:30 p.m., on November 9, 1989, the Berlin Wall, the symbol of a divided Cold War world, was coming down. To this day, historians debate whether Schabowski simply made a mistake or whether he knew exactly what he was doing. But either way, one slip of the tongue helped bring down one of the most infamous walls in history. The Four Pests campaign. Sometimes trying to outsmart nature ends up backfiring in the worst possible way. In the late 1950s, as part of Mao Zedong's Great Leap Forward, China launched something called the Four Pests campaign. The goal was simple: wipe out 4 things that were seen as harmful to people and crops: rats, flies, mosquitoes, and sparrows. On paper, it sounded like a good idea. In practice, it turned into a disaster. The biggest mistake was the war on sparrows, especially the Eurasian tree sparrow. The government believed these birds were eating too much grain. So millions of people across China, men, women, even schoolchildren, were ordered to destroy nests, smash eggs, and chase sparrows endlessly. People banged pots and pans in the streets to keep the birds from landing, forcing them to fly until they literally dropped dead from exhaustion. The campaign was fueled by propaganda and Mao's conviction that humanity had to conquer nature. And for a while it worked. The sparrow population was almost wiped out. But then the unintended consequences hit. Without sparrows, there was nothing left to keep insect populations in check. Locusts and other pests multiplied like crazy, swarming fields and destroying crops. Instead of solving food shortages, the campaign made them even worse. Combined with disastrous farming policies and environmental mismanagement, this helped trigger the Great Chinese Famine, an event that killed tens of millions of people. By 1960, the government quietly admitted the mistake. They ended the war on sparrows and shifted their attention to bedbugs instead. But by then, the damage had already been done. Thomas Midgley Jr.'s few inventors have ever shaped the modern world as much as Thomas Midgley Jr. And sadly, few have left behind such destructive consequences. In 1921, while working for General Motors, Midgley discovered that adding a chemical called tetraethyl lead, better known as leaded gasoline, could stop engines from making those annoying knocking sounds. It was hailed as a breakthrough. But early factories that produced the fuel quickly showed the dark side. Workers exposed to the chemical suffered hallucinations, mental breakdowns, and in some cases, death. Despite this, the fuel was heavily promoted and spread rapidly around the globe. Midgley's career didn't stop there. In the late 1920s, he also helped develop Freon, the first chlorofluorocarbon, or CFC, marketed as a safe cooling chemical for refrigerators. It worked well, and before long, CFCs were being used in everything from aerosol sprays to medical inhalers. At the time, it seemed like another genius solution. But years after Midgley's death, scientists discovered the truth. CFCs were tearing holes in the ozone layer, the very shield that protects Earth from harmful ultraviolet radiation. The discovery triggered international bans on CFCs, but the damage had already been done. One historian even remarked that Midgley probably had more impact on Earth's atmosphere than any other single human being in history. Midgley's own life ended just as tragically. In 1944, after being paralyzed by polio, he built an elaborate system of ropes and pulleys so others could move him in and out of bed. But the invention backfired. One day he became entangled in the device and was strangled to death. Some say it was an accident, while others suspect it may have been suicide. Brilliant, inventive, and catastrophic. Thomas Midgley, Jr. His legacy is a sobering reminder that not every solution stands the test of time. The nuclear bear. Sometimes the fate of the world hangs on the smallest, strangest twist of chance. It was around midnight during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the closest the world has ever come to nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union. At a U.S. military base in Duluth, a guard spotted a shadowy figure climbing the fence. Now keep in mind, military planners at the time believed that if the Soviets ever launched a nuclear strike, they might begin with sabotage against American bases. So the guard assumed the worst. He fired his weapon and triggered the sabotage alarm. That alarm automatically went off at nearby bases. But at one particular base in Wisconsin, Volk Field, there was a dangerous wiring mistake. Instead of sending a standard sabotage alert, the system blared a klaxon siren, the one reserved for nuclear launch orders. The pilots stationed there were already at DEFCON 3, just one step below full-scale war. They had been told explicitly there would be no drills at this alert level. So when that siren sounded, they believed it was the real thing. They scrambled for their jets, each one armed with nuclear weapons, convinced World War III had begun. By the time someone realized it was all a mistake, the bombers were already taxiing to the runway. That's when an officer, thinking fast, jumped into a car, raced across the airfield, and managed to wave down the pilots just in time to stop them from taking off. And the mysterious intruder who set off the whole chain of events? Not a Soviet agent, not a saboteur. It was a bear. If that officer hadn't gotten there when he did, a wandering bear might have accidentally triggered the start of a nuclear war. The Byzantine refusal of engineer Orban. Sometimes the fall of an empire can hinge on a single missed opportunity. In the mid-1400s, an engineer and iron founder from the Kingdom of Hungary named Orban offered his services to Byzantine Emperor Constantine I. Orban had ambitious plans for massive new cannons, siege weapons unlike anything the world had seen before, but the Byzantine Empire was broke. They didn't have the money or resources to fund his work, so the emperor turned him away. Rejected, Orban went to someone who could pay, the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II, who at that very moment was preparing an assault on Constantinople. Mehmed immediately recognized Orban's value and gave him everything he needed to succeed. Within just 3 months, Orban had constructed a gigantic cannon known as the Basilica. It was so huge it required 60 oxen just to drag it into position. When the Ottomans laid siege to Constantinople in 1453, Orban's cannon became one of their deadliest tools. Its thunderous firepower smashed through the city's legendary walls, fortifications that had stood for centuries. That siege ended with the fall of Constantinople and the final collapse of the Byzantine Empire, which had lasted for over 1,000 years. And it all might have been different if one struggling emperor had found a way to keep an ambitious engineer on his side. Kim Jong-Nam's Disneyland trip. Sometimes the downfall of a powerful heir comes from something as simple as a trip to Disneyland. Kim Jong-Nam, the eldest son of North Korea's leader and half-brother of Kim Jong-un, was once expected to succeed his father. By the late 1990s, he held influential posts in the Ministry of Public Security and even oversaw efforts to modernize North Korea's IT systems. He seemed destined for power. But in 2001, everything changed. Kim Jong-nam was caught in Japan, traveling on a fake passport, trying to make a secret visit to Tokyo Disneyland. The incident was humiliating for North Korea's regime. His father was so embarrassed he canceled a planned trip to China and quietly began stripping Jong-Nam of his influence. From then on, Jong-Nam lived mostly in exile. He moved between China, Macau, and Southeast Asia, often living a far more open and luxurious lifestyle than the rest of his secretive family. He sometimes gave interviews to foreign reporters, and intelligence agencies suspected he had close ties to China and may even have worked with the CIA. When Kim Jong-un was officially chosen as North Korea's next leader in 2010, Jong-Nam became a potential threat. South Korean intelligence later revealed that Kim Jong-un issued a standing order for his assassination. Jong-Nam survived several attempts, and at one point even wrote a letter begging his brother to spare his life. But on February 13, 2017, his luck ran out. At Kuala Lumpur Airport in Malaysia, 2 women approached him and smeared VX nerve agent on his face. Jong-Nam collapsed and died soon after. The women were arrested, but both claimed they thought they were participating in a prank for a TV show. Most experts believe the assassination was carried out on Kim Jong-un's orders. And while Jong-Nam himself later said his real fall from grace came from supporting economic reforms and openness, ideas he picked up while studying in Switzerland, it was a trip to Disneyland that marked the beginning of his end. Rome's trust in a Germanic noble. Sometimes the greatest danger to an empire doesn't come from the outside, but from the people it chooses to trust. In 9 AD, Publius Quinctilius Varus, the Roman general in charge of the new province of Germania, relied heavily on one of his own officers, a Germanic noble named Arminius. Arminius had trained in Rome, fought in the Roman army, and earned their confidence. But secretly he was working to unite the Germanic tribes against Roman rule. That summer, as Varus marched back to his winter base with nearly 20,000 Roman soldiers, Arminius told him about a small local rebellion nearby. Trusting him completely, Varus led his legions off course into the dense, swampy forests of northern Germany. The terrain was brutal. Heavy rains slowed the troops, the formations broke apart, and the Roman army could no longer fight the way it was trained to. That's when Arminius sprung the trap. Over several days, Germanic warriors launched relentless ambushes, striking from the trees, using the land to their advantage. The Battle of the Teutoburg Forest had begun, and it was a slaughter. Almost the entire Roman force was annihilated. Varus himself chose suicide rather than face capture. The defeat was so catastrophic that Rome abandoned its ambitions of conquering lands east of the Rhine. Emperor Augustus never again pushed for expansion into northern Germany. The numbers of the destroyed legions, 17th, 18th, and 19th, were never reformed, their loss haunting Roman military history. And many of those same Germanic tribes, united under leaders like Arminius, would later grow strong enough to play a part in the eventual decline of Rome itself. Germany's D-Day decisions. In the months leading up to D-Day, Germany's leadership was divided, confused, and slow to act, a deadly combination. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt believed the Allies would strike at Pas de Calais, the closest point between Britain and France with key ports and a direct route into Germany. Erwin Rommel, responsible for coastal defenses, also focused on Calais, but warned the Allies could land anywhere, including Normandy, which is exactly where they ended up. Hitler, as usual, couldn't make a clear decision. He split the German tank divisions between the two plans, leaving some too far inland to respond quickly, and others not far enough to serve as a proper mobile reserve. In the end, neither commander got what they needed. Meanwhile, the Allies ran a brilliant deception campaign called Operation Fortitude, tricking the Germans into expecting the main attack at Calais. Even after the Allies landed in Normandy on June 6, 1944, many German leaders, including Hitler, thought it might just be a diversion. Rommel happened to be away visiting his wife for her birthday, and other officers were off duty because of bad weather forecasts. When Rundstedt asked permission to move reinforcements, Hitler delayed the decision. By the time the counterattack was approved, Allied air forces had already destroyed supply lines and disrupted troop movements. The German command structure was falling apart. Despite fierce resistance, the Allies secured 5 beachheads on D-Day and brought in over 150,000 troops. Rommel later tried to warn Hitler that Germany's defenses were collapsing, but Hitler refused to believe it. Then, on July 17th, Rommel was seriously injured when Allied planes attacked his car. With chaos and confusion still spreading through German leadership, Germany lost its chance to stop the invasion. Russia's Alaska sale. Sometimes what looks like a bad deal at the time turns out to be genius. In 1867, the Russian Empire sold Alaska to the United States for $7.2 million, about 2 cents an acre. After losing the Crimean War, Russia worried it couldn't defend Alaska in a future conflict, especially against Britain, whose forces were nearby in Canada. Selling the territory to the U.S. not only brought money but also blocked British expansion. At the time, many Americans mocked the purchase, calling it Seward's folly, after U.S. Secretary of State William Seward, who negotiated the deal. They saw Alaska as a frozen, useless wasteland. In reality, the acquisition gave the United States strategic access to the Pacific and added territory more than twice the size of Texas. Over time, Alaska revealed rich natural resources, from oil to minerals, proving the skeptics very wrong. Sometimes a bold move that everyone doubts ends up reshaping history. Alexander the Great leaving no heir. When Alexander the Great died in 323 BC, he left behind the largest empire the world had ever seen, stretching from Greece to India. But he made one fatal mistake. He left no clear heir. His only direct successor was an unborn child. His half-brother Aridaeus suffered from severe mental disabilities and couldn't rule effectively. With no stable plan for succession, Alexander's top generals, the Diadochi, rushed to seize power. What followed was nearly 50 years of betrayal, shifting alliances, and brutal civil wars known as the Wars of the Diadochi. Men who had once fought side by side with Alexander now turned on each other, carving up the empire for themselves. The result was chaos. Alexander's dream of a unified empire died with him. One by one, members of his royal family, including his son Alexander IV, were murdered during the struggle. By 281 BC, the great empire had shattered into rival kingdoms constantly at war. The long-term impact was enormous. Instead of one empire uniting East and West, the ancient world was plunged into centuries of conflict, opening the door for the rise of Rome. All because one of history's greatest conquerors failed to answer a single question: who would rule after him? Columbus's miscalculation. Sometimes a huge historical event happens because someone got the math wrong. When Christopher Columbus set out to reach Asia by sailing west from Europe, he was working off a big mistake. By his time, many scholars already had a pretty good understanding of the Earth's size, thanks to thinkers like Eratosthenes, but Columbus ignored the accurate estimates. He believed the Earth was much smaller than it actually is, and he thought Asia stretched far farther east than it really did. Based on this miscalculation, Columbus confidently claimed he could reach Japan in just a few weeks of sailing. Most experts disagreed, insisting the voyage would take far too long to be feasible. Still, the Spanish crown decided to fund him, impressed by his boldness and determination. Ironically, if Columbus had used the correct numbers, the journey would have seemed impossibly long and risky, and he probably never would have set sail. Instead, his miscalculation, and the unexpected presence of the Americas blocking his route, led to one of the most famous accidents in history: the European discovery of a whole new continent. Sometimes, a mistake can change the world. Treaty of Versailles' harsh terms. Sometimes a peace treaty can plant the seeds for the next war. After World War I, the Treaty of Versailles in 1919 imposed extremely harsh conditions on Germany, conditions that would shape the country's future and, some argue, alter the course of world history. The treaty forced Germany to accept full blame for the war, surrender territory, drastically reduce its military, and pay massive reparations to the Allied powers. Many Germans felt humiliated. They had hoped the peace talks would follow the more lenient vision of U.S. President Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. Instead, they faced what British economist John Maynard Keynes called a Carthaginian peace, designed to crush Germany rather than build lasting stability. Keynes warned that the severe financial penalties would hurt both Germany and Europe as a whole. Across Germany, anger and resentment spread. Millions of ethnic Germans suddenly found themselves outside the nation's new borders. The loss of land, military power, and pride fueled nationalism. This climate of frustration, worsened by the Great Depression, created fertile ground for extremist politics and helped propel Adolf Hitler to power. While the Treaty of Versailles wasn't the sole cause of World War II, its harsh terms, and the bitterness they left behind, played a major role in the rise of Nazism and the path to another global conflict. The Maginot Line. After the devastation of World War I, France decided it needed to protect itself from another German attack. They built what became known as the Maginot Line, a massive system of fortifications stretching along the border with Germany. The goal wasn't to make France invincible, but to slow down any German advance, give the French army time to mobilize, and keep battles away from French soil. Construction took place during the 1930s, at a time when Germany was growing stronger and France couldn't fully rely on help from Britain or the United States. With a smaller pool of young men after the First World War, France opted for a defensive strategy to compensate for its limited army. The Maginot Line ran from Switzerland to Luxembourg and featured underground bunkers, massive artillery, and heavily fortified positions. But the line had critical gaps. The Ardennes forest and the border with Belgium were lightly defended because military planners assumed these areas were too difficult for a major army to cross. That assumption would prove deadly. In 1940, Germany bypassed the Maginot Line entirely by advancing through Belgium and the Ardennes, catching the Allies by surprise. The parts of the line that were directly attacked mostly held up, but it didn't matter. The Germans had already gone around it. After the war, historians and military analysts debated whether the Maginot Line was a clever defensive measure or a costly mistake. It remains a classic lesson in preparing for what an enemy might actually do, rather than what you hope they'll do. Operation Barbarossa. Some military plans sound simple on paper, but reality has a way of proving them deadly wrong. In June 1941, Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, an invasion of the Soviet Union. Hitler and his generals expected a quick, decisive victory. They planned to crush the Red Army in just a few weeks and secure the vast Soviet lands before winter. But things didn't go as planned. At first, the German army made staggering gains. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops were killed or captured in massive encirclements around Kiev and near the Sea of Azov. By late 1941, German forces were closing in on major cities like Leningrad and Moscow. Then reality hit. Long supply lines, brutal weather, fierce Soviet resistance, and poor planning slowed the advance. Leningrad wasn't captured, only surrounded, leading to a horrific siege that claimed over 1 million civilian lives from starvation. Near Moscow, German troops even got close enough to see the Kremlin, but a surprise Soviet counterattack, reinforced by Siberian soldiers, pushed them back. By the end of 1941, Germany had lost more than 800,000 men. The disaster of Barbarossa forced Hitler to take direct control of military operations, which often made decisions worse. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union began pushing west, reclaiming territory, and eventually taking control of large parts of Eastern Europe. What began as a plan for a lightning victory ended up shaping the post-war world, creating the Eastern Bloc, and laying the foundation for the Cold War. And the human cost? More soldiers and civilians died on the Eastern Front than in all other battles of World War II combined. A wrong turn and World War I. Sometimes history changes because of a simple mistake. On June 28, 1914, in Sarajevo, Archduke Franz Ferdinand was killed, not because of a perfect plan, but because of a wrong turn. Earlier that day, a bomb had been thrown at his motorcade, but it failed. For safety, drivers were supposed to take a different route, but the message never reached them. By sheer accident, the Archduke's car turned onto a side street where one of the would-be assassins, Gavrilo Princip, happened to be. Princip had stopped there for food after the failed bomb attempt. When the car tried to reverse, the engine stalled, giving Princip the perfect opportunity. At close range, he shot Franz Ferdinand and his wife, Sophie. That wrong turn didn't just end 2 lives. It set off a chain reaction that would engulf the world. Within weeks, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Alliances kicked in, and a local conflict spiraled into World War I, reshaping the entire 20th century. Sometimes history hinges on the smallest moments, and a wrong turn can change the course of the world.